Elisha Whiting Sr. was born in 1762 in Hartford, Connecticut. His maternal great-grandfather, Joseph Wadsworth, saved the Connecticut charter from the hands of the British. Elisha Sr. carried on the patriotism by serving in the Revolutionary War during his teenage years. Elisha became a sea captain. He married Susanna Butler. His untimely death left his widow to raise 3 young children in poverty.
Their only son, Elisha Whiting Jr., was bound out to a cruel Quaker to learn the carpentry trade. The carpenter was so harsh that the adolescent ran away to Massachusetts to work for a wheelwright.
Elisha Jr. fell in love and married the wheelwright's oldest daughter, Sally Hewlett. Sally was a beautiful 17-year-old who wrote excellent prose and poetry. She was part Indian, from the tribe of Chief Massasoit.
Sally and Elisha Whiting moved from Massachusetts to Nelson, Ohio in 1817. They became some of the most respected citizens of Nelson. Elisha followed the trade of wagon and chair maker and did fine work. The Whitings were honest, generous, and firm in their convictions. They were kind and loving parents who taught their children self-reliance.
Nelson, Ohio, was considered the western frontier at the time, rich with timber. The Whitings planted many fruit trees and built a double log house, using one room to live in and the other for a wagon shop. Elisha built the furniture and cupboards. Great blazing fires would be built in the spacious fireplace for cooking, warmth, and light, which provided pleasant evenings for the family. Our progenitor, Edwin, was their 3rd child. Education was limited, but Edwin and his siblings were taught the basics and could read and write. This idyllic life in the forest developed in Edwin a deep love for the beauties of nature, the trees, the flowers, the mountains, and the desire to hunt. He learned chair making and carpentry from his father, and his workmanship as a young boy was considered very good.
When Edwin was 24 years old, he married Elizabeth Partridge Tillotson, an Ohio girl of French descent. She was a highly educated schoolteacher. Elizabeth was quiet, refined, kind-hearted, and industrious. She had a very brilliant mind, yet was modest and reserved in her appearance and manner. Their firstborns were twins William and Olivia. Olivia died the day of her birth. Baby Helen arrived 2 years later.
Sometime during the year 1830, one of Edwin Whiting's uncles, Sylvester Hewlett, traveled on business from the township of Nelson to Kirkland, Ohio. He met Oliver Cowdery and other missionaries. Uncle Sylvester was baptized in March, a month before the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was organized. He returned to Nelson with a copy of the newly published Book of Mormon.
In May of 1830, the prophet Joseph Smith and Parley P. Pratt visited the Nelson area. Edwin's mother, Sally, was baptized on October 29, 1830. Edwin's father, Elisha, barely tolerant, was not yet converted. He once wished he had Joe Smith on his workbench.
It'd be a pleasure to finish him off with my handsaw.
Elisha's family, knowing of his intense dislike of the prophet, hoped and prayed for Elisha's conversion for some time. In 1831, Joseph Smith moved from Kirtland to a home within 5 miles of Nelson, giving the family many more opportunities to come in contact with the prophet.
Elisha continued to object to this new religion with its angel message, and made life miserable for those in his family who had joined the church. It would take a miracle for him to change his mind.
Elisha was taken sick with a strange fever, which baffled the doctor, who finally stopped treatments, explaining he could do no more.
When Elisha's death was imminent, death hiccups set in severely, and his jaw had to be pried open with a spoon to give him water or nourishment. Sally asked him to let the Mormon elders administer. He refused, saying,
I would not have their dirty paws on me.
He got worse, much worse. His jaws were set, he could not speak, and everyone expected him to die. Sally approached him again, as she had done many times, asking if he would accept the elders, giving him a blessing. At a small sign of willingness, Sally invited the elders. Immediately following the blessing, the hiccups ceased, his jaws loosened, and Elisha asked for food and water.
Here was a case of instant healing. On the 4th day following the blessing, the ice in the river was chipped away, and Elisha was baptized. Father Elisha's commitment to Joseph Smith and this new religion was, henceforth, complete and unwavering.
Due to persecution, the extended family gradually moved to far west Missouri. Edwin and Elizabeth moved there in 1838. Elizabeth and Edwin and some of his brothers and sisters were baptized in August of 1838 by Thomas B. Marsh.
We were so impressed by the principles and teachings set forth by the prophet Joseph Smith, we joined the church and received a testimony of its truthfulness. Elizabeth Tillotson Whiting.
The Whitings were only in Far West a short time when a mob, several thousand strong, ordered them out. Every house in the village was burned except Father Elisha's, which was spared because he had taken sick a second time and could not be moved. The saints were driven out of Far West with scanty provisions in midwinter.
In the year of our Lord, 1837, I, Elisha Whiting of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, moved my family, then consisting of my wife and 5 of our children, into the state of Missouri, Clay County. There I purchased and improved a 100-acre farm. In a few months, 6 of the 7 of us were taken sick. The ill ones were moved by wagon to Carvel County, where I had previously purchased 80 acres of government land, for which I had paid cash. I was left behind, and in a few days also fell ill. A mob threatened to come upon my land and drive me from my home, notwithstanding my sickness. Through the kindness of a neighbor, I escaped from their snare. Not hearing what had become of me, one of my sons returned from Caldwell County and found me at the neighbor's. I was very low, but he put me into his wagon on a bed and carried me to Caldwell, where I lay sick for many months. There we thought surely to settle ourselves in peace, as the authorities had promised us protection, but in this we were mistaken. Not many days after our move, a ruthless set of barbarians, claiming to be the freeborn sons of America, marched their thousands of demons into the county, and there threatened to exterminate or drive us from our lands and home. We, being insufficient to meet so large a band of ruffians, were obliged to submit, and for a trifling sum, to sign away our property.
With few provisions, many of the saints had to travel without tent or wagon cover and wade through mud and snow. There was no one to take them in, even after they reached Illinois. While at Liberty Jail, Joseph Smith, appalled at the circumstances the saints were enduring, asked the suffering families to itemize their losses so that the detailed evidence could be presented to the world and heads of governments. Edwin and his father both compiled lists. Their combined losses totaled over $8,000. The value today would be more than $150,000 in cash. Equivalent value of the land would be considerably more in today's real estate market, as Edwin and his father together owned more than 180 acres free and clear of debt. The damages were more than monetary, Father Elisha explained.
In the first place, our family was all sick with the chill, fever, and ague, and at the same time we were driven from the county of Clay to Caldwell, having to leave shop and tools and many of our effects with our wheat stacked in the field. In the next instance, I bought and fenced and improved 80 acres in Caldwell County. I was then mobbed and driven from that, having to leave farming equipment, a quantity of stored crops, along with furniture and household possessions, all left behind. There was loss of health, being driven from our home, being exposed to storms of every description, and lying in the open air for 6 or 7 weeks, and lying in beds drenched with rain and snow. I am still feeble and unable, by being thrown into the rheumatism, to do a day's work. My wife is also afflicted, and not much better, damage inestimable. Elisha Whiting.
The Whiting, Cox, and Hewlett families were sent to settle near Lima, Illinois, about 25 miles south of Nauvoo. The new little settlement became known as Yelrome. By 1840, there was a Lima stake, and the Yelrome branch had grown from 16 to 424 members.
Sarah was born to Elizabeth soon after the family arrived in Yelrome. Twin girls, Lavina and Louisa, were born the next year, but did not survive. Emily Jane was born the next year.
Edwin became a counselor to the branch president, Isaac Morley. He also was appointed a colonel in the Nauvoo Legion. The prophet Joseph Smith visited and spoke often.
The principle of plural marriage was introduced to the residents of Yelrome during a conference presided over by Brigham Young, 10 years before it became generally known throughout the church.
My deep commitment to my faith can best be explained by a quote from my patriarchal blessing received while we were living in the Lima stake. Because of the uprightness of thy mind and the integrity of thy heart, thou didst embrace the new and everlasting covenant with the purest of motives. Thou hast been persecuted and driven for the cause of thy Redeemer. The persecution and hardships continued, as did the deep love I felt for my husband, my family, and my Savior.
1844 was a presidential election year, and Joseph Smith announced his candidacy. On April 22, 1844, Apostles Brigham Young and Wilford Woodruff spoke at a conference in the Lima stake and asked for volunteers to serve missions. Edwin Whiting and Walter Cox were two of the volunteers. Amidst their preparations to leave for the mission field, trouble was brewing in the Lima and Yelrome areas. 12 days later, Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram were murdered in Carthage jail.
What a time it was. Dark and gloomy. The wind blew, the thunder roared, lightning flashed, and the very heavens poured forth their tears. Cordelia Morley.
The grieving saints were counseled not to seek revenge, and relative peace was established. Edwin was still serving his mission to Pennsylvania at the time. He soon returned home and took up arms with his brothers to protect his family and property.
In January of 1845, Edwin married his second wife, a widow by the name of Elmira Mehitabel Meacham Palmer, who had borne 2 children, endured the death of her child and her husband, and was raising one surviving son, Ammon Babbitt Palmer. She was just 20.
I respected Elizabeth as head of the household. The years in Lima were happy ones as we helped establish ourselves, and the men of the Whiting and Cox families volunteered time to work on the Nauvoo temple. I became a midwife and a practical nurse and spent many hours giving care to the sick.
Anti-Mormon conflicts in Yelrome continued to build. Unfortunately, the little settlement was surrounded by extreme anti-Mormon communities such as Warsaw.
September 11, 1845, a vigilante group gathered at Yelrome. Mobbers set fire to several homes and businesses, including Father Elisha's chair shop. Elizabeth Whiting sat in the rain on a pile of wet bedding, holding 3-year-old Emily Jane in her arms as she watched her home burn. At least 29 homes were destroyed in the settlement on this terrible day.
I'll give you an example of the brutal conditions the Whiting family suffered at the hands of those angry men. The mob started a rumor that they were to begin depredations in a certain neighborhood. So Uncle Chauncey Whiting left his home and wife Editha and son Isaac for the day to go and defend his neighbors' homes. The rumor was only a trick. The mob came and told Aunt Editha they would give her an hour to get her things out of the house, for they were going to burn it. She asked what they had done, that their house must be burned, and the mob informed her they were bound to drive the Mormons from the state. Little Isaac, who was sick, was rolled into the bedding, and a mobber threw him out on the ground. When Uncle Chauncey came home, he found his house burned and his wife sitting in the garden in a rocking chair, holding Isaac and guarding their few possessions. Emma Whiting.
rescuers helped the members of the Yelrome settlement relocate to Nauvoo.
Edwin and his brothers returned to Yelrome and finished the chairs they had been making before hostilities broke out. On their way, they passed the farm of a man who owed money for chairs previously purchased. In his fields they saw a flock of their own sheep. One of the brothers called the name of a favorite, and the small sheep came to the fence to greet them.
They made no attempt to recover their sheep or money. Instead, they focused their efforts on finishing chairs and gathering the corn from their farms by dark of night. They sold the completed chairs in Quincy, Illinois, and used the proceeds to help them purchase supplies for their trip west. Marie Whiting.
Housing was difficult to find in Nauvoo. Edwin and his family eventually shared a rented home with the Isaac Morley family. Elizabeth gave birth to Edwin Lucius there in October of 1845.
In Nauvoo, the first priority was to finish the temple. The men were asked to give a tithe of their time, donating 1 day in 10 to work on the temple, which had to be completed and guarded around the clock.
As persecution continued, the saints prepared to evacuate Illinois, and efforts turned towards outfitting wagons and preparing the supplies. Wagon shops and blacksmiths worked day and night. Green timber was prepared and delivered to the city, where the various parts were boiled in salt water and kiln dried. The Whitings and Coxes were responsible for doing their share of the work.
The temple was dedicated and endowment sessions began on December 10, 1845. Preparations were steadily made, and temple work was quickly performed for as many as possible.
On January 27th, Elizabeth knelt across the altar and was sealed to her husband. Edwin was next sealed to Palmyra. Then he was married and sealed to a third wife, Mary Elizabeth Cox. At this time in church history, less than a few dozen families had entered plural marriage.
The following day, Palmyra bore Edwin another son, named Edward Lucian. Edwin's new bride, Mary, the sister of Walter Cox, Edwin's good friend from Ohio, was 20 years old. She had recently converted to the church and had already taught school for 6 years. Mary was very even-tempered, extremely loving, kind, and considerate. She was generous and tactful, never given to fault-finding or criticism. She was very humble and sincere.
My father was a miller who died when I was 3 years old. We were a family of 12 children. My brother Jonathan was born 6 months after father's death. Mother was never well after father died, though she lived 8 more years. William, my oldest brother, was a youth when nearly the whole care of the family devolved on his young shoulders. He thought it best to move from Oswego, New York, to the northern part of Ohio to get land to farm. He accordingly went to Nelson, Portage County, Ohio, and secured 80 acres of woodland. I always loved books and learned very easily and was always encouraged to gain education. At 14 years of age, I was far ahead of most children. Occasional chances to attend a select school and 1 term at an academy prepared me to be a teacher. In 1844, I came west with my brother Walter and his wife Emmeline Whiting Cox. I was baptized in April of 1845 by Isaac Morley in the Mississippi River. I taught 3 terms in Yelrome, Illinois before the persecutions, then fled to Nauvoo. It was there I entered into the celestial order of marriage with Edwin Whiting and his dear wives Elizabeth and Almira.
It became Edwin's custom to carry wood and start the household fires for each wife at the beginning of every day. Besides being of service, it gave Edwin a few minutes for private, meaningful conversation as he tended to the fires.
Soon the preparations for the saints to leave Nauvoo were intensified. 25 groups known as emigrating companies were organized for the trips. The first of the saints crossed the ice on the Mississippi River at Nauvoo, then gathered at Sugar Creek, Illinois, and waited for Brigham Young.
The exodus from Nauvoo caused unimaginable hardships for the saints. When Brigham Young heard about the extreme sufferings, he counseled the struggling families.
Now is the time for labor. Let the fire of the covenant which you made in the house of the Lord burn in your hearts, like flame unquenchable.
Sometime in late February, the Cox and Whiting families left Nauvoo. By then, the river was no longer frozen, so it was necessary to cross the river on ferry boats. Mary was expecting her first baby. Traveling in the same wagon with Edwin and Mary were Edwin's parents, Elisha and Sally, and their unmarried sons, Sylvester, Alman, and Louis, as well as the widowed wives of their sons William and Charles and 5 of the grandchildren.
Elizabeth with her 5 young children and expecting a new baby, and Palmyra caring for newborn Ellen along with her other 2 remained behind. Edwin returned for all of them in late May.
Wagons were reserved for the ill, the aged, and small children. The record is one of terrible privation, sickness, and death. It took months to travel distances that should have taken days.
We only passed through one mud hole today. It was about 6 miles long.
It took an entire month for each of the immigrating companies to assemble in Sugar Creek. It took 131 days to cover the next part of the journey, 300 miles across Iowa.
By contrast, it took the Pioneer Company, as the first group was called that traveled to Salt Lake, only 111 days to travel 1,050 miles to the Salt Lake Valley the following year. Inadequate preparation, lack of knowledgeable guides, delays, miserable weather, and difficult terrain made the Iowa journey one of the most trying in church history. The companies were reorganized into larger groups of 100, and plans to reach the Rocky Mountains that season were changed. Way stations along the route were established. Murray Whiting.
The Whiting family was sent to the largest way station, Mount Pisgah. Edwin and Mary arrived in early May of 1846. Isaac Morley was branch president, and Edwin Whiting and Walter Cox were his counselors.
The Whitings and Coxes put up a chair factory and made chairs, which they hauled back to Quincy, Illinois, where they found a market for them.
All of the many months of struggle had weakened the saints' health. In an outbreak of cholera, there were so many sick in the family at the same time that no one was well enough to care for the ill ones. Sally Hewlett Whiting, Edwin's precious mother, and his beloved daughter, little Emily Jane, just 3 years old, both died. 2 of his nieces, Eliza and Louisa Cox, also died. Elizabeth and Edwin had lost 4 of their first 7 children.
4 of Edwin's brothers, Chauncey, Alman, Sylvester, and Louis, and one sister, Catherine, decided Brigham Young should not be the leader of the church. Plural marriage was also difficult for them to accept. They followed a Mr. Cutler, called themselves Cutlerites, and moved to Clitheroe, Minnesota. Some of their descendants still live there, and occasionally contact has been maintained for more than 5 generations. Even in these trying times, Edwin's faith remained strong. He continued to manufacture chairs and took them by wagon to Missouri and sold them.
After the Pioneer Company left, Lorenzo Snow became president of the branch at Mount Pisgah, and Edwin became one of his counselors. The next year, when President Snow began his journey west, Edwin became president of the now dwindling Mount Pisgah branch.
During the years the family lived in Mount Pisgah, 3 children were born: Mary's son Albert, Elizabeth's son Oscar, and Almira's daughter Catherine.
Finally, in 1849, my family began the trek. I was age 39. My 3 wives, Elizabeth, Almira, and Mary, and a total of 9 children, traveled to the Rocky Mountains in 2 wagons. The 3 children old enough to help were ages 14, 12, and 9. The other 6 children were ages 3 and under.
We know Mary drove one of the teams, and Elizabeth's Helen Amelia, age 12, rode with Mary to help her with her toddler. It is presumed Elizabeth drove the other team, assisted by her oldest son, 14-year-old William, and perhaps by Almira's 9-year-old son Ammon. Almira, who had tiny baby Catherine probably rode in the wagon, caring for her newborn and tending to the needs of 4 other children ages 3 and under. Edwin would help wherever most urgently needed, as well as maintaining the wagons, seeing to the livestock, and hunting game for the family. Imagine the challenges of caring for 6 very young children while traveling, setting up, and breaking the camp. At least 3 of the children were in diapers.
On their way.
Ezra T. Benson was in command of the combined company of 100. George A. Smith was in charge of the other 50. The 2 groups traveled one behind the other, preserving natural resources while ensuring safety from the Indians.
It was Edwin's turn for guard duty over the encampment, that night positioned in a single line. A cloud of dust was seen in the distance. It was a large herd of stampeding buffalo. Edwin grabbed his whip and ran forward from the unyoked lead wagon toward the stampede. He made his stand and cracked the whip at the leaders of the herd. Gradually they turned inch by inch. The black whip cracked unceasingly. As the last of the herd stampeded by the camp, Edwin fell exhausted to the ground, arms swollen from shoulder to fingertip. His action had caused the lead buffaloes to turn just enough to save the wagon train. Edwin said,
"I didn't fight the battle alone. The Lord was there too."
Edwin hunted and fished along the trek, as fresh meat was valuable to the travelers. One day, hunting on foot, he selected and killed one small enough to be carried on his back. It was late by the time he was ready to rejoin the company. Striding along, he heard the howl of a wolf. Soon, more wolves joined in. A pack of wolves had smelled the fresh blood and were stalking him. After another mile, the pack got so close that Edwin feared for his own safety. He stopped and divided his kill, leaving most of it for the wolves. When at last he reached camp with a hind quarter, he was thankful to be safely back with at least a share of meat.
Volumes might be written of that long and tedious journey. We saw many herds of buffalo, but our worst and most trying experience was on the Sweetwater. After reaching the Black Hills, west of the Rocky Ridge, we were overtaken by a furious wind and snowstorm, which continued for about 3 days. Such was the severity of the storm and the intensity of the cold that most of the immigrants took to their beds, being unable to cook food or indeed to keep themselves warm. Our cattle remained in the willows, suffered considerably, and many of the best cattle in the company died. Father counted 9 of ours in one little bunch of willows.
Emergency provisions were sent to them by Brigham Young. On October 28, 1849, the Whiting family arrived in the Salt Lake Valley. Mary Cox Whiting wrote,
I have never beheld a sight so good and so beautiful as Salt Lake City. It was one of the prettiest places I ever saw. We were so thankful our journey was at an end.
Their rest was short. Within a week, the Whitings, Coxes, and Morleys, and other families were called to settle the Sandpitch River, now known as Manti.
The settlers continued on and arrived in what would be called Manti on December 1st, 1849, with almost nothing to eat, no food for their cattle, and no shelter to keep them warm. In freezing weather, they dug holes in the side of the hill. The shelters they had made were located in the south side of the hill, where the Manti Temple now stands.
These dugouts and their wagon boxes, which they stood up on end, with wagon covers stretched between, were their only protection from the elements in one of the harshest winters on record. Edwin's family shared a 16-foot square dugout with their chair shop in one end. 3 wives, 9 children, and their chair shop. They were very crowded. The wood for the firewood and for the chair shop was hauled in on sleds from the hills by the oldest boys and their father. Edwin put up a foot lathe and got to work.
Our bread was mostly of grain ground in a coffee mill. The Indians were with us all the time, and our scanty food supply was shared with them always.
The snow was so deep the cattle could scarcely get grass, and most of them died.
Edwin and Orville Cox put on snowshoes and with a little parched corn in their pockets for food, placed their bedding on a sleigh, and started to Salt Lake City for help. When they reached Nephi Canyon, they found Brother Dace Henry, his wife, and an Indian, snowbound. Their cattle had died, and their wagons with the promised supplies were all covered with snow. The young wife was very sick, so Edwin gave them the sleigh to pull her to Manti. Edwin and Orville put their quilts on their backs and walked on to Salt Lake City. They reported conditions to President Young. Additional aid was sent immediately to replace the snowbound provisions.
Throughout the winter, the family gathered wood and made chairs in their shop. 100 chairs with rush-bottom seats were taken to Salt Lake and traded for food in the spring. The Indians were always to be watched, but we were on their land and did our best to keep peace with them.
3 baby girls were born to the family that spring. Harriet was born to Mary in April, Louisa was born to Elizabeth in May, and Cornelia was born to Elmira in June.
Good weather brought new, unexpected problems. From the cracks and crevices in the rocky hill that had protected them, from holes in the ground and from caves under slabs of stone crawled hundreds of rattlesnakes coming out of hibernation. The snakes were everywhere. On the south slope, they lay in coils on the paths.
They crawled under the wood piles in the dwarfed underbrush and under wagon boxes. In the dugouts, the snakes hid in wood boxes, toolboxes, cupboards, and beds.
The first night the snakes appeared, 300 rattlesnakes were killed. Several more nights they killed hundreds of snakes. Amazingly, not one person was harmed.
The hill with its caves and holes was no longer an inviting refuge. The settlers moved away from the dugouts and ventured out into the valley.
The Indians became hostile, so it was necessary to build a stone fort for protection. The settlers lived within the protecting fort walls inside small log cabins.
The family continued to grow. Mary's son Charles was born 2 years after they arrived in Manti. The year before Edwin left on his mission to Ohio, Elizabeth's last child, Caroline, was born. Elmira's son Elisha was born a month later. Philetus Edgar was born just after his father left for the mission field in 1854. Elmira's little Edwin Lafayette was born the year after Edwin returned from his mission. Edwin Marion was born to Mary a month later. A log house was built as a school the second winter, and Mary was one of the 2 teachers.
I tried planting fruit trees, shrubs, and flowers, but they could not survive the very cold winter. Our crops were poor, but we managed to exist and were a happy family in spite of our hardships.
While still living in the stone fort, the family built a 2-story home on First West and a block south of the temple site next door to the Cox family. The upstairs floor housed 2 dormitory rooms, one for the girls and one for the boys. Downstairs there were 3 big living rooms, one for each wife. each with a beautiful fireplace and a mantel and a beveled plate glass mirror. Marie Whiting.
Edwin served his mission in Ohio from the fall of 1854 to the summer of 1856. I spun wool, made extra hats, and knit socks for my neighbors to procure food for my children. My son William tearfully allowed me to exchange his pet colt for a wagon load of corn. Cattle were driven off and stolen by the Indians. Men had to carry guns when they went to fields to work. Grasshoppers twice cleared off the growing crops. Our family survived on sago lilies, pigweed, and other wild greens which the Indian had taught us to eat.
Upon his return from his mission, Edwin brought many kinds of fruit trees, some from his father's farm that he had helped to plant when a boy. He also brought shrubs and flowers and again tried to grow them, but the climate was too cold.
On October 8, 1856, Edwin was married to his fourth wife, Hannah Haynes Brown.
As a child, I lived in Nauvoo. My family was of the Quaker persuasion. My father learned to respect and love the saints and refused several times when men would try to get him to help make the Mormons leave Nauvoo. My father was a doctor. He contracted typhoid fever. Due to his untimely death, I was married at the age of 14 to a 36-year-old brickmaker named Horace Bristol. When I was 16, I gave birth to a son who lived 1 week. 4 months after baby Mifflin died, I left my husband and moved to Canesville to live with my older sister Jane. I was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1854. I earned my own way across the plains by cooking and washing for 2 motherless boys, and I drove an ox team myself. I met Edwin as he was returning from his mission to Ohio. Several months later, we were married by Brigham Young in his Salt Lake City office. I came to feel Edwin's other wives were my sisters, and I loved and respected them in their homes as such. My precious Abby Ann was born 2 years after our marriage, and our son Lorenzo Snow Whiting arrived 2 years later, while we were still in Manti. Twin sons Melvin and Alvin were born in Salt Lake when Lorenzo was 2, and the year after our last child, another son, Francis, was born in Springville. He died when he was nearly 8 months old. I grieved over the loss of my 2 baby sons.
While the family lived in Manti, Edwin was among the foremost men in religious and civic affairs of the community. He was counselor to the stake president, he was mayor of the city for 4 years, and he served as a member of the territorial legislature for 2 terms.
On April 14, 1857, he married Mary Ann Washburn Noble, his 5th wife. They were sealed in the endowment house in Salt Lake City.
My parents were raised as strict Quakers, but they joined the church in 1837 when I was 9 years old. The Washburns were good friends with Orson and Parley Pratt, who taught us the gospel. My father was a tanner and cobbler. He attended the School of the Prophets and served in the Nauvoo Legion. The prophet Joseph Smith was often a visitor in our home. I watched the Nauvoo Temple gradually rise from moonstones near its foundations to sunstones at the top of the pilasters. I watched the city grieve at the prophet's brutal murder. My family was in attendance on the great occasion when the mantle of the prophet fell on Brigham Young. I was sealed to Joseph Bates Noble, 18 years my senior. I was the 3rd of his 7 wives. During the 10 years of our marriage, I bore 5 children. 4 of them died. Joseph Washburn Noble was my only surviving child from this marriage.
Mary Ann's first husband was a difficult man. They were divorced after Mary Ann arrived in Utah. When she became Edwin's 5th wife, Mary Ann fit right into the growing Whiting family and was a help to Edwin in his political responsibilities required of the new mayor.
2 children were born to me while we lived in Manti. Daniel was born in May 1858, and Monroe was born in November 1862. I honored Elizabeth and was grateful for the love and understanding each of the wives gave to me.
In Edwin's 2nd term as mayor, Mary's son Arthur was born. 6 days later, Hiram was born to Palmyra and died the same day. It was her third such loss. In 1861, a great blessing came, bringing Palmyra much joy when her beautiful daughter Sylvia was born. By then, 29 children had been born to the Edwin Whiting family. 6 had died in infancy. 18 of the children were born during the 12 years the family lived in Manti.
At Christmas time, I tried to make the holiday festive. I would make a dough sweetened with molasses, roll it out, and cut out doll and animal shapes, and fry them crispy brown. I would make molasses candy and parch some corn and fill the Christmas stockings with these treats.
3 brothers were named after their father. To distinguish the boys, they were usually called by both Edwin and their middle names while they were young. Edwin Lucius was the oldest, followed by Edwin Lafayette, later known as Henry, and then Edwin Marion.
All the children felt the love of many people who were striving to live by the commandments of the new church they had accepted. They learned that any one of the mothers in the big house would supply them with bread and butter when hungry and comfort when hurt.
Each wife was given her own place in Edwin's heart. The wives were protected and well provided for. When the hormone levels got too high, Edwin would retreat alone into the forest with bags of pine nuts and parched corn.
Edwin was an excellent beekeeper. Modern techniques were quickly adopted in Springville. Prior to this time, the traditional hives were used one season and the colonies destroyed in order to harvest the honey. The new box and tray method still is used today. Edwin's sons learned the carpenter trade and blacksmith trade in his shops and started them with their own hives.
It wasn't enough that the children learned to work. The important thing in the Whiting home was that the children liked to work and took pride in a job well done, whether it was learning to read well, building a chair, or sewing a seam.
We wasted nothing. We raised broom corn and made our own brooms. We grew field corn to dry and make into cornmeal. Children went barefooted until cold weather came to save on shoe leather. Even the wood ashes were saved to make lye for the making of soap and to soften the wash water. We grew sugar cane to supply ourselves with molasses. The tops were used for chicken feed and seed. We raised flax, treated it, and wove it into cloth. We also gleaned the heads of wheat missed by the reapers. The wool from our sheep was clipped, carded, and spun by hand into yarn for stockings and mittens. All the old clothing was woven into rugs and carpets. Even worn-out rags were used as kindling.
Edwin got permission from Brigham Young to move his growing family to Springville, which had a better climate for growing the fruit trees he had struggled to cultivate in Manti. He bought a strip of land on 400 South and Main. It continued east where the Springville Art Museum now stands. It extended on east of 200 East. He built 2 adobe homes exactly alike at 450 South Main Street, leaving a space of 50 feet between. He later filled in the space with a center structure which connected the other 2 houses. The remodeled home came to be known as the Big House. It was 2 stories with spacious windows and doors and large rooms. Choice fruits grew in the orchards. The front yard was a garden of flowers and berries. Marie Whiting.
All 5 wives moved to Springville when the big house was ready. Smaller homes were eventually built for each of the wives. Mary's last 3 children were born in Springville. May was born in 1862, John was born 6 years later, and Frederick was born in 1870. Frederick was Edwin's youngest child.
Some of the first needs of the pioneers were to have enough land for crops and water to make them grow. They also needed wood for fuel and for sawing into lumber. With the need to establish his 16 sons, Edwin took up 160 acres on Union Bench, now Mapleton, and divided it among his older boys. But as the young ones grew up, there was need for more land. Edwin decided to homestead land in Hobble Creek Canyon. a log cabin was built in the canyon which became Mary's home.
A sawmill was built above their home. Mary's son, Edwin Whiting, bought a steam engine and furnished the lumber for Springville for a number of years. The trip from the sawmill to town took about 5 hours.
Throughout the years, Edwin transplanted many evergreens from the mountains. He would go up in the canyons and select small trees. Packed securely in a wagon box, the trees were carefully marked so they could be set the same direction they stood in the canyon. Many of Edwin's evergreens and fruit trees were planted throughout the county. Among these, a large cedar still stands on Main Street. He also transplanted trees around the old courthouse in Provo, those at the Springville City Park, and a large evergreen that stood for many years southwest of the Manti Temple.
Temple work became a priority in Edwin's later years. He traveled to and attended sessions in the temples available to him at that time, St. George, Logan, and Salt Lake. He was honest and charitable. He loved his wives and children and provided them the comforts of life.
Plural marriage did not bring lasting happiness to Palmyra. She divorced Edwin, remarried, moved to Healdsburg, California, and had another child. Some of her children were near the ages of their half-siblings and continued to grow up in Springville and remain close to their father. Years later, in a letter to a granddaughter, Almira wrote,
God's judgments are righteous and sure, but his saints will be cared for. Let us search our hearts and see if we are ready to meet the Lord in peace. We must keep his commandments, and if we love him, we will. If we love him, he will save us. If you never made it a practice of going away by yourself and falling on your knees and asking God to help you, do it now.
My children and I prospered in Springville until 1876, when 2 of my boys, Albert and Charles, were called to go and help colonize in Arizona.
In the meantime, Mary's daughter May's health became so poor that it was thought that a journey might do her good, and with the encouragement of her father, they fitted out and went with Charles. May was benefited by the move, but never entirely recovered her health, and in the spring of 1882 she wanted to return to Springville.
We again commenced the homeward journey, but alas, the sands of life were too nearly exhausted, and when we reached House Rock Springs, we stopped with Brother Jedediah Adair, who lived there at that time. Although she lived only 2 or 3 days, it was a great comfort to be with friends. That was the only great trial of my life, losing May and having to leave her in that lonely grave. But I must acknowledge that the hand of the Lord, who doeth all things, was with us. We reached Springville in June, weary and sorrowing, but comforted greatly by the sympathy of loving friends.
Mary Ann was never in good health while she lived in Springville. She was a fine housekeeper, meticulous seamstress, a loving mother, and a good friend and neighbor. Before her death, she made her own burial clothing. She died at an early age, 54, following a stroke in 1882.
Edwin died December 8, 1890, at the age of 81. He had 20 sons and 16 daughters. 25 of those children were living at the time of his death, along with 135 grandchildren and 29 great-grandchildren.
Edwin had given up homes and property, watched the apostasy of many of his siblings, sorrowed when children, nieces, and his parents died along the path to Zion. 2 of his brothers died in the years the family struggled westward before the trek. Nevertheless, he followed the difficult doctrine of plural marriage, served 2 missions, endured countless physical hardships, and provided a loving home to a large family, all for the sake of worshiping his Savior.
Edwin lived the principles of his religion.
My children, I have guarded the prophet Joseph Smith while he slept. I have guarded him while he walked the earth. I have slept at his side. I have felt the power of God in his life. I have seen the mantle of the Holy Ghost hover over him. I have received the witness, and I know that he is and he was a prophet of the living God. And I want you children, my family, to honor him and to honor each succeeding prophet following him. Your security in the kingdom of God and your security in the church depends upon your full allegiance to the prophets in the earth. This testimony I leave with you, and I know that he was indeed a prophet of the living God. Edwin Whiting.
Elizabeth spent the twilight years of her life in a comfortable home of her own, surrounded by an abundance of fruits and flowers.
I have lived a full life, have had a wonderful husband and family. I truly have been blessed by the Lord.
Elizabeth died 2 years after Edwin and was buried beside her beloved husband in the Springville Cemetery. She was a kind and gentle, home-loving person, loved by all. Hannah had taken good care of Edwin during his final years. She died of blood poisoning 6 years after his death. Palmyra died 2 years after Hannah in San Bernardino, California, in a home given to her by her daughter Sylvia.
In August 1901, 4 of Mary's boys decided to return to Arizona. Mary decided to go with them. Perhaps the thought of seeing the lonely grave of her daughter May again induced her to once more make the long trip in a wagon. The remainder of her life was spent in sunny Arizona.
Mary loved young people and children, joining in their games and amusements until the day of her death. She was never idle, could knit, read, and rock the cradle at the same time. She spoke no evil. She was patient and uncomplaining in sorrow and adversity.
Never have I regretted my polygamous marriage to Edwin, knowing as I do that God has blessed us together.
Mary died in St. John's, Arizona in 1912 at the age of 85 years.
The Whitings were true pioneers in every sense of the word. They worked hard, they loved their God, and they honored their covenants. Now, you and I must turn from the past and to look to the future, forge new ground, and lead our own families in becoming modern pioneers, in claiming promised blessings as members of this great church and Whiting family. To the youth here today, let me say it is important that you learn from the older. We have been where you are, but you have not been where we have. Listen to your parents and to your leaders.
Inscribed on an archway in the Nauvoo Temple, the immigrating saints left the following message: "The Lord has beheld our sacrifice. Come after us."